Good evening. My name is Daniella. And before I begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that we are all gathered on the traditional territory of the Piscataway and the Pamunkey peoples. It's now standard protocol in Canada and Australia and New Zealand and many countries to acknowledge the people who have historically stewarded the land we now occupy. And I believe that it's important that we begin to do the same thing regularly in the United States. And if you'd like a resource to learn more, this website, native-land.ca, is great. I also want to ask everyone gathered here this evening to make room for discomfort. I think increasingly we've become unwilling to engage in uncomfortable conversations with each other in the name of productive dialogue. And I may say things that feel uncomfortable, and Matika may say things that feel uncomfortable, and Mark may say things that feel uncomfortable. But if instead we could try to figure out what makes us feel uncomfortable and why. I got my start as a news photographer in New York while I was a college student when I was about 19 years old. And I've wanted to be a journalist as long as I can remember. And for me, journalism meant newspapers. So I started shooting for the New York Daily News, covering fires and crime scenes. And it was a great grounding in what it meant to be a journalist. I really loved that time. But after about 5 years, I realized that being a spot news photographer really meant that the extent of my connection to stories and the people and places I was covering was a matter of minutes or hours. And not only that, but I didn't always have complete editorial control with how my work would be published. So I decided that I wanted to try moving into slightly more long-form journalism, into slower journalism. And one of the first places that took me to was East Africa, where I documented the independence of South Sudan and the rise of an anti-gay law and homophobia in East Africa. And because of that work, I went to an HIV conference in Australia in 2014. And when I was there, I read a single line in a UN report that referenced the fact that the group of people in the world with one of the fastest growing rates of HIV was Indigenous Canadian. And that made no sense to me. From a public health perspective, Canada has a really great healthcare system. It's better than ours. It's nationalized. It's mostly free. They've pioneered progressive harm reduction strategies like free needle exchanges. All of these things meant to keep people safe. And yet, there was this epidemic. There was this massive public health crisis. And so I went to Canada for a month. I drove through British Columbia and Saskatchewan and Ontario, interviewing HIV-positive First Nations Canadians. And almost every single person I talked to referenced their time in Indian residential school. I don't know how many people here have heard of Indian residential schools, or as we call them in the United States, Indian boarding schools. But I went to school in the DC area. I grew up here. I went to college in New York. This was never part of my textbooks, of my history curriculum. But starting in the 1870s, the Canadian government created this network of boarding schools that was meant to forcibly assimilate Indigenous children into the dominant culture. And a government employee called an Indian agent would show up on reserves and in Native communities and would effectively kidnap Indigenous children under the age of 15, sometimes as young as 2 or 3 years old, and send them off to these schools. And once they got there, their hair was usually cut. They were made to wear Western clothing. They were punished if they spoke their language or practiced any sign of their culture. There was rampant physical and sexual assault. And in extreme cases, there was sterilization and medical testing. We tend to talk about the oppression of Indigenous people on this continent as things rooted in the past. We talk about Wounded Knee and the Trail of Tears and things that happened more than 100 years ago, things that happened centuries ago. But the last residential school in Canada closed in 1996, when I was 10 years old. The Canadian government didn't issue a formal apology until 2008. If you look on this map, you can see the distribution of these schools throughout Canada, in every single province except for Prince Edward's Island, and as far north as the Arctic Circle in Baffin Island. So I'm in Canada, and I'm reporting on what I think is a public health story. And one of the first people I meet is Ellie, who's my age. She's HIV positive. She has hepatitis C. She's an active injection drug user, which in Indigenous communities in urban centers in Canada is the primary way in which HIV is spread. And I spent several weeks with her and her family, and I slowly learned, getting to know her, that both of her parents, all 4 of her grandparents, and every single one of her aunts and uncles had gone to residential school. And while it wasn't her experience specifically, she very much had acquired a lot of the trauma that the rest of her family had. And so I photographed her family very much as a news photographer, doing what I was trained to do, to photograph the things that are in front of me, to tell a story in that way. And I got home and I realized that I had missed the story, that I had fundamentally failed as a journalist. I think we all know what those images looked like. We've all seen photographs of the opioid crisis in the United States. I don't need to show you those photographs. I didn't need to publish them. And they're real. It doesn't mean that they're not pure news, that they don't have value. But I think often the problem with those photographs is that it doesn't allow us to leave room for empathy for the people in them. It doesn't allow us to know anything more about the context of their lives, of their family history. And so I needed a different way to tell the story. The first time I had gone, I had missed the point. I didn't see that this was part of a much bigger legacy. So I decided that I needed to go back a year later and try to tell the story in a different way as a visual journalist. And I couldn't really do it as a news photographer because I couldn't photograph in the schools anymore because they no longer existed, and I had failed to photograph the legacy in a way that I thought was effective. So I had to come up with a different technique. And for me, that ended up being creating double exposure portraits of residential school survivors, where I superimposed portraits of the people I spoke to with the sights and memories of their boarding school experiences. So in Mike's case, the secondary image is a mural on a factory building about 3 blocks from where he went to school. In some cases, the double exposure is a little figurative, but as often as I could, I tried to be literal. I tried to visit the exact site of where every person had gone to boarding school to connect them to that place. And that was a challenge because in Canada, a lot of the school buildings were torn down. When the boarding school system started to shut in the 1970s, the tribes took control of a lot of these buildings, and the community decided collectively that they wanted to destroy them, that they didn't want these places that had been the home of a lot of dark memories. So in many cases, these buildings didn't exist, especially in Saskatchewan. But in Valerie's case, this is one of the few residential school buildings that's still standing, the Muskowgan Indian Residential School. For Gary, it became more of a case of trying to reconstruct his experience. And he had told me most of his memories centered on going to Mass, of having to convert to Christianity, of having this foreign experience, of having to go to service every single morning. And I went to the Capel Valley where he'd gone to school. And there was nothing left to photograph. The only building that had survived was the gym. And it wasn't particularly visual, and it also didn't really relate to his experience. So based on our conversations, I ended up recreating the view that he had described to me that he had from outside of the church windows every Sunday. You know, we consume more photography now than we ever have before. And in some ways, that's a good thing. Photography is information, is news, is power. But it also means that in some contexts, I think we've become increasingly desensitized to some images, specifically images of pain and war and human suffering. And so for me, a way to tackle this story, to get people to actually stop and engage and think about the people and the stories behind them, was to create something that required a little deciphering, that actually forced people to stop and look. We can always talk about how systems of oppression lead into other systems of oppression, how the past and the present are always connected. In the United States, we can look at the connections between slavery and the modern prison system. In Canada, there are inextricable ties between the residential school system and the foster care system. When boarding schools first started to close in the 1970s, instead of children being taken away from their communities and sent to boarding schools, children instead were taken away from their communities and sent to white foster families. And Dee Dee is one of many people who ended up going through both systems. There are now currently more children, more Indigenous children in care in Canada than ever went through the boarding school system. I think it was probably easier for me to start this project in Canada because I didn't have to deal with the nationalistic shame of what my government had done to people in my country. But of course, the more I read, I quickly realized that actually the United States created this system. That the first off-reservation boarding school was called Carlisle. It was in Pennsylvania, and it was created by a man who became a US Army general named Richard Henry Pratt. And then the more places I went, the more I interviewed people, the more I realized that pretty much anywhere there has been a colonial government and an indigenous community, some form of coercive assimilation education has existed. Some form of cultural genocide has taken place. From these portraits in Australia to here in the US. And so I've been working on this project for nearly 5 years now, and I hope to continue it for a while to come in at least 15 countries around the world, from Taiwan to Norway to Colombia. And I think this is a deeply important history. I think this is a story that we need to know, that needs to become a mainstream part of American consciousness. But at the same time, it feeds into another problem, what Nigerian writer Chimamanda Adichie calls the danger of the single story. And that's what happens when a group of people is only represented in one way. Chimamanda talks about coming to the United States to go to university and meeting her college roommate, who was shocked that she knew how to speak English and knew how to use a stove. When my mother came to the United States from Vietnam in the 1960s to go to college, she routinely encountered professors and classmates who asked her what it was like to grow up in the jungle. And the truth is, for indigenous storytelling in the United States, so often the stories that are told about Native people are centered in trauma. And it's maybe not a coincidence that a lot of those stories are told by non-Native journalists like me. So for one of the stories in the December issue of National Geographic magazine, what I wanted to do to look at the other side of this narrative was to take a more introspective look at what happens when one group of people is not part of the mainstream representation of their own stories, of their own histories. And National Geographic felt like a good home for this project because, in all fairness, like many media outlets in this country, National Geographic has a very colonial legacy of telling the stories of non-white people. I do a lot of teaching in the US in middle schools and high schools, and one of the first things I ask students is, what are your first associations with Native Americans? What are the first things you think about? And almost every single time, I get the same 3 answers. It's Thanksgiving, Pocahontas, Christopher Columbus. These are the stories we're still teaching our children, right? And not only are they rooted in destructive omission, they're rooted in lies. Pocahontas was at most 12 years old in that fun Disney love story. Thanksgiving was a meal that took place in the wake of indigenous genocide. Christopher Columbus cannot be framed as having discovered a continent that had millions of inhabitants. And I think we've just forgotten how prevalent these images are. And we still have ongoing corporate logos that feature Native Americans on our butter, on our cigarettes. We have military aircraft called Blackhawks and Apache helicopters. We have cars called Jeep Grand Cherokees. They really are everywhere we look. And I think one of the most visible and probably the most harmful instances of this is in the sports mascots that continue to exist in this country. This is a man named Jim Stamper. He is a lifelong Cleveland Indians superfan, and he is perhaps best known for showing up to almost every single game with larger-than-life cardboard cutouts of the Indians' logo, Chief Wahoo. Starting in 2019, a little over a month from now, the team will actually phase out Chief Wahoo from the stadium, so he will no longer appear on player uniforms. He won't appear on the signage in Progressive Field any longer. But the team will continue to sell merchandise in its stores with his likeness, and they will not stop fans from showing up to games wearing his image. It's hard for me to look at this caricature and imagine us treating any other ethnic group in the United States in this way. I cannot possibly imagine my identities, either Vietnamese or Jewish, being represented with a caricature like this. But I do like that someone tried to flip the script. And then we have to look at the football team in our own backyard here. There is some debate as to what the actual etymology of the word redskin is, But no matter what, we know for a fact that it was the word used by county and state governments when there was a bounty placed on the head of Native Americans, when civilians were paid to murder Native people in this country. That is indisputable. This is a clip from a Minnesota newspaper from 1863. We have pro sports teams in this country called the Redskins, the Indians, the Braves, the Chiefs, the Blackhawks, but we also have more than 1,000 high school teams in this country with Native mascots. These are the Cuyahoga Heights Redskins in Ohio, which happens to be the state with the highest number of Native mascots. And one of the problems with when we allow these things to persist, when we don't correct them, when we let them stay, is that we tell our children that this is okay. We tell our children that this is acceptable behavior. These are the Logan Chieftains, also in Ohio. From Ohio, I went to upstate New York to photograph a reenactment of the French and Indian War that takes place every year, and people come from all over the world to participate in this event. There were Native allies fighting on both sides of this conflict, alongside both the English and the French. And the people who came to reenact as Native troops, as the Wyandot, as the Seneca, as the Iroquois, were almost exclusively non-Native. This gentleman is Swiss. His name is Marcus, and he and his wife come to this event every year. And this is not just a hobby for him. Back in Switzerland, he spends as much of his time as possible living as a Native American. He and his wife cook indigenous food. Those Seneca-inspired tattoos are real. He and his wife were married in a Seneca longhouse. So at some point, this appropriation of Native identity actually morphs into the very act of playing Indian. And we can think about appropriation on a spectrum for sure. Some of these things are more harmful, more toxic, more violently racist than others. But we also have to remember that all of these things feed into each other. These all prop up the same system. These are eagle tail feathers that hang from the rearview mirror of a car owned by a man named Greg Carroll. He's based in Sacramento, and he calls himself a medicine man, and he charges hundreds of dollars an hour for sacred ceremonies that are fundamentally rooted in Native practice. And that's not that uncommon. We can see there are a lot of non-Native practitioners of things like ayahuasca ceremonies and sweat lodges and people who smudge. But the fundamental irony here is that not only were Native children taken away from their communities, sent to boarding schools, and punished if they engaged in their own spirituality, but in the United States, it was actually illegal until 1978 for Native Americans to practice their own religions. It wasn't until the passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act in '78 that that changed. So it's perhaps understandable now to see why indigenous people would be a little defensive of their own spirituality when non-Native people try to be practitioners. And as an aside, these 5 eagle tail feathers that are hanging from this rearview mirror are actually illegal. It is a felony in the United States for non-Native people to own any part of an eagle. And then there are just the basic misunderstandings that pervade the way we talk about Native America. We continue to speak about Native Americans as if they are one monolithic group of people. But there are nearly 600 federally recognized tribes in this country with different cultures and languages and identities. And so when we reduce the headdress and the teepee and the totem pole and the dream catcher and these little symbols that we co-opt and turn into a single pan-Indian identity, we are ignoring the reality of many, many different nations of people. This is a souvenir shop on Route 66, and it's in the Southwest in Tucumcari, New Mexico. The teepee is not historically from this part of the country. They're from the Great Plains, but this teepee has Pueblo symbols on it, a group from the Southwest. So this would be like me standing up on stage in a kimono with a conical hat and a bindi saying that I am an Asian. It's just not something that I would ever do. This is the opening image to the magazine story, and it's actually my personal connection to this project. When I started mapping out where I wanted to go, I knew that I needed to go to a Cleveland Indians game. I knew that I wanted to go to that reenactment of the French and Indian War. I wanted to go to an electronic music festival. I went to a July 4th rodeo in Cody, Wyoming. But I knew that I wanted to find Peter Toth, who's a Hungarian-born sculptor who has spent his entire life making these larger-than-life statues of Native Americans out of tree trunks. And he originally set out to make 50, one for every single state. But he is now 70 years old, and he has completed 74, and he is showing no signs of stopping. And I know his work because when I was a child, I used to spend some time each summer in a little town in Delaware called Bethany Beach. And at the entrance to Bethany Beach is one of his statues. And it looks like a totem pole, and the town of Bethany actually refers to it as a totem pole. And so as a child, I thought that this was a leftover relic of some long-gone Delaware tribe. It wasn't until decades later, working in British Columbia and Washington State, that I realized that totem poles come from the Pacific Northwest. You would never find one from a culture on the East Coast. This fueled my own misunderstandings. And I'd like to close by asking everyone to look at this project and ask themselves the question, who is in charge of how we remember? And who is in charge of how we forget? This is a place in northern Wyoming called Dead Indian Pass. And outside of the obvious horror of that name, it's actually rooted in a history of Nez Perce leader Chief Joseph leading a band of 700 men, women, and children through the mountains in what's now the Shoshone National Forest, eastward, trying to escape the US cavalry and reach the plains. And through some tactical brilliance, they did that successfully. They managed to evade the army. And one person was left behind. A single man was left behind who was captured and killed by US soldiers. And so this place got its name for the one man who died instead of the 700 who lived. That's the defining narrative that was left behind. That's the thing that we chose to remember. So what I'd like all of us to think about is what happens when we are not all collectively responsible for telling the human story. What things do we leave out? What things do we forget? Thank you very much. And I'd like to welcome Matika Wilbur to the stage.
Good job, Daniella. Good job. Let's give her another round of applause. Good job. Matika sieht stachobs chat dwalta tuthlela dwalta swinamish. Tigwit siayas, nostalgia siayas. I want to start this evening by saying good evening, relatives. I'd like to thank all of you for being here this evening, and I would like to take a moment to introduce myself. I'm Matika Wilbur. I'm from the Swinomish and Tulalip people. I'm from the people of the Tide. My grandmother is Laura Wilbur from Swinomish, and I'd also like to acknowledge the Piscataway ancestors that hold this place and say Tigwitsi, thank you for allowing us to be within your indigenous territory. Where I come from, we raise our hands in thanksgiving. It's part of the way we acknowledge one another, part of the way we bring our collective consciousness into the room. So everybody try it with me. Put your hands up in the air and say Tigwitsi. That's really good. I'd like to say Tigwitsi to Susan and a big Tigwitsi to Wesley for making this happen. And I'm a hard person to wrangle, so I'm really impressed. And I also want to thank National Geographic for taking a courageous first step toward a new model of awareness with honest photographic representation and hopefully some unbound dialogue. I also want to acknowledge that 15 years ago I came out here and I stood in that courtyard out there, and I was still in photography school, and I looked up at that space and thought there's no way I'll ever be welcome here or invited here. And so I stood in that courtyard tonight by invitation, and Drake sung for me. Started from the bottom, now we here. And it was one of those moments that I feel really good about. So thanks for sharing that with me. And I also want to acknowledge my elders in the room tonight and say, Tigwitsi, thank you for letting me share before you, and ask you for permission to share and apologize for the ways that I don't say things properly, and ask that you be graceful with me, and if there's something you think I need to change or ways that I've misrepresented, I ask that you take a moment to share that with me. And you're all my elders because I'm like 12. I think I look 21 at least. And I understand that the reason we're here tonight is to see how we can bring our hearts and minds together to create a better experience for our children. When I started this project, although I was a photographer, I was also a teacher at the tribal school on my res. The leaders in my community came to me and asked me, Matika, can you put together a visual literacy curricula that represents every corner of Turtle Island? Can you draw from images and stories made by Native people for Native people? We want a whole year's worth of curricula. I said, yeah, Auntie, I got you, I'll do that. And there was a problem. I couldn't find the images. I think that when I started looking, what I found was the narrative that we're familiar with, the outdated narrative, the incomplete story perpetuating an American historical amnesia. It's the romantic, dire, insatiable story of extinction. It's not surprising when we consider our American education. In recent findings from Dr. Stephanie Freiberg in Reclaiming Native Truth, they concluded that nearly 87% of state history standards failed to cover Native American history in a post-1900 context. Other studies reveal that 82% of undergraduate youth believe Native Americans to be extinct. Have a look at something. This is what happens when you Google African American. What do you see? Mostly men. Kanye. This is what happens when you Google Asian American. Young, mostly women. Contemporary folks. The American flag. This is what happens when you Google Hispanic American. When you Google Latinx, all you get is a map. So when you Google Hispanic American, you get families and different folks, mostly people together in an image. And this is what happens when you Google Native American. The preponderance of Native American mythology and representation is fixed in an outdated and damaging narrative. We're imagined as leathered and feathered, as near extinction, as inferior and therefore needing saving, as less than human caricatures fit for mascots, as lower class, underserved victims, which is conflicting with other major stereotypes, which is, of course, that Indians are wealthy from casinos and that we don't pay taxes. And all of these misconceptions contribute to the collective consciousness that affects the lives and the identities of the people that I belong to, of the people that I love. You see, it affects us in the way that we imagine ourselves, in the ways that we dream of possibility. It lodges itself into the self-esteem of our youth. And recent studies actually reveal that 92% of Native American youth believe that they will die by the age of 25. I witnessed it with my own eyes when I was a teacher at the tribal school on my res. I buried 19 of my own students in 4 years. And after so much loss of goodness and potential, I'd sit in lodges with my fellow teachers and we'd be crying and begging the Creator to help us. What are we doing wrong? What should we be doing differently? Why does this keep happening? And it was here, in these classrooms, in these spaces, that I realized that if I didn't participate in changing the narrative, if I didn't do something, then my silence was complicit in the erasure of my own people. And I couldn't sit by idly to watch it unfold 6 feet beneath ground. So, in an effort to provide Native youth positive imagery and understanding, I sold everything, and I packed my bags, and I hit the road. For the past 6 years, I've been sojourning in my war pony in an RV known as the Big Girl, and because she likes to back it up, in an effort to photograph over 562 federally recognized tribes, the number of tribes when I started this project. I now realize that that might have been short-sighted because I didn't realize that I would also go visit state-recognized tribes and urban Indian communities and our tribal relatives in Canada and into Mexico and down into Puerto Rico. And, so I think when I'm done with this project, I will have been to about 800 tribal communities in the United States and around the world. The project has been this whirlwind of a journey. It's been this epic adventure. I've had the best time. I started in Washington. I worked my way south through Oregon and California, went over into Arizona, New Mexico, went down into Texas, met the Sasquatch for the first time. I went on down to the Everglades, learned how to eat alligator, went all the way up to Haudenosaunee country, got to hear stories about the Great Law and the foundation of democracy. I made relatives and friends. I went deep into the Grand Canyon. They said, Matika, can you ride a horse in here? I was like, I'm from the Northwest, we ride canoes. They said, cool, we'll get you a helicopter. I went all the way up into Alaska. I went on a canoe journey in Alaska that lasted for a month. We ran out of food 3 days in. I lost 15 pounds eating seal meat for a month. It was great. You should try a seal meat diet. It works. One time I was driving over Yosemite. My brakes got hot. I didn't know that could happen. And a redwood tree had to save my life. Another one time, we were coming down the one, and we were going around a corner like this, and I had an intern driving. You know how interns are. They have a need for speed, and she got going at like 70 miles an hour, and I was in the back cooking bacon. And and bacon grease went like that, and then it turned into a real sacred big girl that day. I caught right on fire. And it's been an adventure, to say the least, and it's been the greatest adventure of my life. And the greatest experience from all of this has been the human experience, where I show up as a stranger and I leave as family. And that, to me, has been the greatest gift of this experience. I thought tonight I would talk to you a little about some of my findings and some of the things that I've learned along the way. Of course, the first fundamental lesson that we have to acknowledge, just as Danielle said, is that we are on indigenous land. So everybody say it with me. I am on indigenous land. We are on indigenous land. Ooh, that was beautiful. Y'all good at that. What I've realized is that everywhere I go, there's an indigenous history, story, narrative. There is a connection to an indigenous narrative that is yet to be told, uncovered, and reconnected to. I wondered, what does it mean to be an Indian in 2018? Can I even be an Indian? How could I possibly be something that I never was? Maybe I should ask the question, what does it mean to be a Native American person? I started to find that that might be the wrong question. Maybe the better question would be to ask, how would you like me to define you? What is the proper way to tell this story? How should I label your image? And what I started to find when I started to ask the right questions, I started to find that our people identified ourselves in their traditional ways, in our own languages, in our own stories. And usually that identity is inextricably connected to the land. We identify ourselves as the people of the blue-green water, the people of the tall pine trees, the people that we live within the 4 sacred mountains and other such land-based awarenesses. This is a photo of Colin Soto, Colin's Cocopa. Cocopa is the last tribe right along the Colorado River before you get to Mexico. And Colin remembers growing up traditionally. He grew up in a mud home. And when he was a young boy, he remembers when the river would come through and it would naturally irrigate and they would grow corned beans and squash and other delicious foodstuffs. And they would go fishing, and he remembers that multi-generational home, the love that you experience when you live in a home with all of your relatives. And then he remembers when the river stopped flowing through Cocopa, when they built that dam. And when they moved out of living in traditional homes, and they moved into HUD homes. When they switched from eating a traditional food diet and started eating a commodity food diet. He looked at me, he said, Matika, to be Cocopa is to be the people of the blue-green water. But how can we be Cocopa if there is no more water? Academics now have a term for this crisis of being. They call it solastalgia. It's defined as the mourning that we experience when we separated from a loved home. And even though we haven't relocated, we feel displaced because the face of Mother Earth has changed so dramatically around us. My friend who's Ankh Atamal Atam, which is the Salt River people, the people that eat from the river, he jokes and says, we're going to have to call ourselves Walmart Atam. I think that's why we see our people at the forefront of almost every environmental protection movement in the United States. And this is a more visceral and compelling environmentalism, which is in most Western thinking and training focuses broadly on preservation of natural resources, but it overlooks people's core relationship with their specific sustaining ecologies. It's not surprising, given the related American idea of social mobility. I don't think natives really roll that way, though. I think the prolonged environmental and human holocaust that we have experienced, our mourning and grief at such loss, has reached a pivotal moment. Native nations have taken an unprecedented stand together against the destruction of our homelands through the extraction and fouling of Mother Earth. I saw it here when I went to Navajo Nation, and I walked with these ladies who walked for 2 years, some 1,200 miles to all 4 of their sacred mountains to oppose fracking and extraction within their traditional homelands. I saw it here when I went to visit my Kanaka Maoli relatives in Hawaii. This is John Kekianaana. He's holding in his hand the ancestral kalo that his family has been growing for thousands of years. And one day a man in a suit came and served him a cease and desist, suing him for $75,000, demanding that he stop growing their patented Monsanto kalo. They didn't just bring that suit to Uncle John, they brought it to indigenous farmers all throughout the Hawaiian Islands. And so they formed a coalition. They sued back, and 8 years later, kalo became the first plant in the United States that cannot be genetically modified or altered based off of an indigenous creation story and the right to those people's religious freedom to maintain that connection to their ancestral kalo. I saw it here in Lummi Nation, where our elders say shall no to coal exports in the Salish Sea. We see it here in New Mexico, where Taos Pueblo people, through executive legislation, were finally able to return to their most sacred place in Blue Lake. In Florida, there is indigenous advocacy to restore the Everglades, and I'm sure, as all of you are familiar with, in Standing Rock, North Dakota, there was the largest gathering in the modern era of Native American tribes and people of the world, environmentalists, if you will, and human rights advocates for the peaceful protection of Mini-Wachoni. Water is life, against the Dakota Access Pipeline, the black snake that threatens so much of the quality of the life in the Midwest. And, you know, my friend Dallas, he called me up, he said, Matika, you have to come out here. There's these kids, they're like 13, 14, 15 years old. There's about a dozen of them. And they are going to run across the country from Lakota territory all the way out to Washington, D.C. to try to get an audience with the Army Corps of Engineers to try to stop this pipeline. They need your support. There's about a dozen of them. You got to come out. And I was like, Dallas, dog, like I'm slinging explosives. My mom and I have a fireworks business. And I said, I don't think I can. And he said, Matika, Indian favor, get in the big girl. So, you know, I got in the big girl and I drove out to Standing Rock, and I was supposed to stay for 3 days and I stayed for 6 months. Like good Indian time. And gee, I just fell in love out there. I just loved the feeling. It was the first time I ever actually slept in a teepee. And I probably shouldn't say that, but I did. And I remember going to bed at nighttime and that feeling, you know. I'd hear off in the distance like people singing water songs, and I'd hear people, those pomos singing those beautiful clapper songs, and I'd hear those Paiutes singing those beautiful songs. And oh God, it was such a good feeling. I'd hear those beautiful Lakota men singing those Indian 49s to those pretty Lakota women, and it felt good. I saw things there I'd also never seen before. Things that you can't unsee. Things that I didn't grow up knowing because I didn't grow up during the civil rights movement. I saw a woman lose her arm in protest. I saw people be devastated with freezing water cannons in freezing temperatures. I saw my relatives be ripped out of ceremony. I picked up my sister, a professor at Brown, who'd been kept in a dog kennel after she was arrested in peaceful protest because they didn't have enough holding cells, so they brought dog kennels in to keep the women in, and she was kept in nothing but her underwear for 4 days, and she had numbers on her arm resembling that of Auschwitz. It was the kind of things that you can't forget. And I keep retelling this story because when I think about what happened here, I think about that creation story, the Hunkpapa creation story, where when you look up at the Big Dipper and you see where it's missing a star, and that star came and fell right here in this place, and from there sprang life, and these 3 rivers came out, and that water naturally whirls perfectly in this perfect circular direction and creates the most beautiful sandstone circular rocks. Why this place is called Standing Rock, in fact. How life was made here. And the Hunkpapa people, they take their women out there, they put them out there for ceremony. They bury their dead there. It's important. I was there over Labor Day weekend when all of these decision makers were in a room. It was very fancy. It was in a casino boardroom. and and there's all these environmentalists and activists and attorneys and the head of the tribe, and they're all standing there. What's going to be done? What are we going to do? And this non-Indian landowner came. And he said, hey, you know what? I just thought you guys might want to know. We found some bones where we're going to be digging next week. We found a tibula and a skull, and we found some feet. And, we just thought that you Indians might want to go out there and do like you do, maybe like pray or something. That was Labor Day weekend. The Indians do like they do. They filed an injunction. Because we're attorneys now. And and so, the court filed, it was granted. There wasn't supposed to be any digging. We go out there, and of course they're digging anyways. And what ensued was dog attacks and hundreds arrested. It was vicious. I continue to tell this story partly because of what's happening in Tijuana right now. Because deeply ingrained in our consciousness is this idea that these aren't American values. I saw it over and over and over again on Twitter yesterday. We need to get back to the core of American values. And maybe we have to recognize that the core of American values is rooted in that, and that we need to establish new American values. American values that value indigenous bodies, because the way that we treat our land is directly related to the way that we treat our women. If we are willing to penetrate the earth for her natural resources, unafraid of the consequences, our women, who have been the stewards of our land for millennia, will also feel its effects. Systemic exploitation and corruption of the sanctity of land is dramatically impacting our women who have been the stewards of our land for such a long time. I've been hearing a lot of women's stories as I've been traveling throughout Indian country. And women have the kind of stories that are hard to repeat. They tell me about what happened to them in boarding schools, of how they went in to IHS clinics to have their first baby and came out not knowing that they were sterile. Women, they tell me the stories that I've had a really hard time repeating. Stories like Jenny Parker's from Northern Cheyenne. She was a teacher at the tribal school on Jerez for 25 years. She taught at the Northern Cheyenne St. La Brea Indian School. And one day she was teaching the language, and these police officers came in and they said, Jenny, we need you to come down to the station. We need you to identify a body. It was her daughter's. Her daughter had been brutally attacked and violated. After that happened, she became nearly catatonic. She had a massive heart attack, and she was in the hospital. And she said she was begging the Creator to take her to the other side, and her granddaughter came to her. And she said, Grandma, I don't want to go stay with my auntie. I want to come home with you. And she said, no, sweetheart, I'm going to the other side. Go live with your auntie. And she said, please, Grandma. And Jenny said, well, will you cook? Yeah, Grandma, I'll cook. Okay, well, will you pray? Yeah, Grandma, I'll pray. Okay, I'll get better then. They went home together, and she said her granddaughter would come to her every day. And, come on, Grandma, let's go for a walk around the kitchen. Come on, Grandma, let's go for a walk to the end of the block. Come on, Grandma, let's go for a walk down to the end of the driveway. She said it was the love that put her back together again. They now organize a walk from one side of Northern Cheyenne to the other to raise awareness about what's happening to our Native women. It's a very real part of our current social economic situation. 3 out of 4 Native women experience sexual assault or domestic violence in their lifetime. So for most of our Native sisters, it is not the question of if, but rather the question of when. And you see, I come from Indian country. So when I asked Jenny, what do you want me to tell the people when I show your photo? She said, you tell them that story. Ask them if it matters to them. Tell them our women deserve safety. I have found also in our women's stories a treasure trove of knowledge and strength and wisdom and vision. Women like Deborah Parker and her daughter, Kaya George. Deb Tsialtsa is the former vice chairwoman of the Tulalip tribes, and she's served for many years as a motivational speaker, as an educator, as an activist. She was heavily influential in the Violence Against Women's Act so that we could change the VAWA, so that we could protect our women. Because for a very long time, if a non-Native violated a Native woman within tribal territory, we didn't have the jurisdiction to prosecute. And so many of our cases would be thrown out of our court to the neighboring court system, and it would be thrown out of theirs as well. So if there was this sort of vicious cycle of this continuing to happen, and a few years back we decided to change that, and Deb was a part of that. It's women like Deb and many more who have endured the crisis, transformed the narrative, women who prosper, who become self-actualized and fight for our nationhood, who carry our culture forward, save our languages, our seeds, our histories. Women fully understanding the complexities and power of story as social shaping and crucial to the individual, making it possible for cultural education and Western education to receive equal value in resources. This is a photo of Dr. Mary Evelyn Bellegarde. She's from the Pueblo of Isleta and Okeawinge. She's a retired professor of Indian education from the University of New Mexico. In the 70s, they decided they wanted to open a charter school that would teach language and culture fluently, an immersion program in their own language. So they went to the state and they asked for funding for the charter school, and the state said, well, we really think it would be better if you go to our public schools and speak English. So they sued the state, and they won. And 11 years later, they opened the first charter school in New Mexico, in Walatoa, in Jemez. They said at the time they were seeing a rapid decline of language in their community. And now, some 40 years later, it's estimated that over 90% of people in the Pueblo of Jemez are fluent in their language. Jenny is also like, is also like your favorite auntie. You go over to her house and she does like all good Pueblo women do. She says, sit down and eat. Are you hungry? Sit down and eat. And you're like, no, auntie, I'm not hungry. Sit down and eat. So you sit down and eat. And you eat enormous bowls of red chili. If you haven't had it, it's like dried chili made into soup. It's very hot. And so I started eating the chili, and then I realized, oh my God, I need bread. And not to worry, because Pueblos make the most delicious Horno bread. It comes out, it's like this, it's humongous. And I ate the whole loaf, you know. And so I'm like laid out, you know, on the couch, and Mary says, okay, sweetheart, well, now that you're good and fed, I want to talk to you about Indian systems of assimilation and what you should really do to change that for our communities. I'm like, yeah, auntie, I'm ready. And she said, when are we going to stop asking our children to choose between cultural education and Western education? I think we're ready to stop the assimilation process. The time to change is right now. This is a photo of Dr. Adrienne Keene. She's Cherokee. She's actually Cherokee. Bad joke. You guys didn't laugh. And you know, she's a Stanford and Harvard alumna, and she's now a Brown University professor. She's the author of a blog called Native Appropriation. She's the current co-host of a podcast we're working on called All My Relations that Mark was actually on. And her research is dedicated to understanding the experience for Native youth in higher education. She points out our statistics that for every 100 Native students that start 9th grade, 50 will graduate from high school. 20 of those graduates will go on to higher education, and 1 will graduate from college. It takes 2,500 Native ninth graders to create 1 Native master's graduate, and 7,000 Native ninth graders to create 1 Native PhD. On top of these numbers for Native suicides, the statistics are staggering. I recently heard the shocking statistic that 1 out of 5 Native male university students will attempt suicide during their college careers. And we know that the Native youth experience has the highest rate of suicide among all the ethnic groups in the United States. Dr. Cornell Pewawardy, who's Comanche, where did he go? Oh, he's missing. Dr. Cornell Pewawardy, who's Comanche in Kiowa, is a retired professor from Portland State, and he says that one of the main reasons that our children experience so much disparity when they go to higher education is because our systems are based off of an independent model. If our children are to be successful in their school systems, they draw upon their own independent knowledge. We test to ourselves. We don't draw upon collective consciousness. Your test scores matter unto yourself. That qualifies you for higher education. If you go away from your community and you become a purveyor of Western knowledge systems, you become successful. We hear it all the time on the reservation. The story goes, if you leave the reservation, you could be successful. Sometimes people say, how'd you get off the res? To me. One of my favorite stories around this narrative is of Leon Grant. He's an Omaha Indian. He grew up there in Nebraska. And when he was a young man, he really wanted to go to college, but they weren't letting natives into school yet in Nebraska. And so he told his parents, hey, I think there's a school in Arizona. And his parents said, no, you're going to stay here. You're going to be a rancher. So when his parents went to town to get feed, he wrote him a note and he said, I'm going to college. I'll be back in 4 years. He proceeded to walk from Omaha, Nebraska to Phoenix, Arizona. It took him 49 days. He's like Jesus. He arrived with $19 in his pocket. He went to the local school. He said, I'd like to get into school. He gave them some tobacco. He said, I don't have any money, but if you let me in, I swear to God, I'll pay back every penny. The dean let him in. He graduated from that school, and he went on to theology school. He eventually went on to law school, and then he worked with Dr. King to establish the first American Indian Center in the country, which became the model for almost every American Indian Center across the United States. When Leon passed away 2 years ago, the state of Arizona dedicated a holiday to him to remember the work that he'd done for the civil liberties of indigenous people around the country. I'm super long-winded, so I'm going to wrap up with these last few stories. I want to show you this photo of one of my favorite heroes, current heroes. Her name is Dr. Kimberly Tallbear. She wrote a book called Native American DNA. The work is incredibly fascinating because Kim turns her lens towards scientists that study Indians, critically evaluating the study of genomics. We recently asked Kim, can a DNA test make me Native? To which she replied, of course not. Our identities are rooted in kinship, our relationship to land, our relationship to one another, our decolonized relationship, if you will, is what defines us. Kim is also the author of a fascinating blog titled The Critical Polyamorist, a space for evaluating the effects that colonization has had on our relationships. Colonization has done a number on the way we love. It made two-spirit identity illegal and stripped our second and third gender roles from our societies. Our Apache friend John Sneezy told us wonderful stories about traditional two-spirit roles in Apache societies that are only finally now reawakening. In people's lives like the Jimmies from the Yupik territories in Alaska who were forced into a church-sanctioned marriage at 14 told us we would have never gotten married if the church hadn't made us, but gee, 79 years later, we're still here. My sister, Juanita, from Pueblo of Jemez, is forced to reckon with the question of whether or not she wants to stay in the Pueblo because given current Pueblo policies, if she chooses to marry a non-native, she'll have to leave the Pueblo because our blood quantum policies that have been enforced upon us by a non-native perspective is still impacting our lives. Who are we allowed to love? My friend Desi Small Rodriguez, who's a statistician and a wild woman who just had a baby and is doing 2 PhDs right now at the University of Waikato and the University of Arizona, just did a recent study in Northern Cheyenne and found that by the year 2070, nobody in her community will qualify for enrollment given current blood quantum policies. So the question is the way that we're seen by the outside world, the way that it goes on to shape our policies, it goes on to shape our lives. These are my sisters. We're not going to talk about them. Just kidding. Just kidding. I'm closing with this. These are my sisters, and I got to grow up like this. I grew up in this traditional way. I got to grow up going to canoe journey, paddling on our ancestral canoes. I didn't know what an incredible opportunity it was when I was a kid to know this kind of lifestyle. I remember my mom would say at 4 in the morning, "Get up, you gotta go get on the canoe." And I'd be like, "Well, it's cold." And she'd be like, "Get on the canoe." And then I'd get on the canoe because my mom wins, And nobody told me the stories. I didn't know. I didn't know what had happened in the Northwest, of how early colonizers came to our longhouses and said, "You have to leave your longhouses and move to your 40 acres. And our people didn't want to move out of our longhouses, so they set them on fire. So our people took off for the islands in our canoes. And you see, cavalry can't chase you when they're on a horse and you're in a canoe. So they made our canoe travel illegal. And more than 5 Indians congregated on the water was considered a war party. And so for a very long time, our canoe culture went to sleep. And if you're potlatching people, your culture also goes to sleep when you can't travel to the potlatch. And so, some 100 years later, the city of Seattle was celebrating 100 years of being a city. And they said, "You know what? We should call the Native Americans. We want them to come and celebrate with us. They should come by canoe." So they called Emmett Oliver, and Emmett Oliver said, "Well, nobody knows how to make a canoe, but I'll figure it out." So he started with a little canoe like this, and he made a bigger one. Eventually, he made a great big 16-passenger canoe. They had such a good time protesting, pulling into the city of Seattle, that they decided, we got to do this again. They paddled to Bella Bella. That was 4 years later. That was my first canoe journey. Every year since then, they've been paddling to a different host destination. And this last year, when we paddled to Nisqually, it was incredibly historically significant because that was the last place that a chief was ever publicly executed in Washington State. They executed Chief Leshai because he refused to sign the Medicine Creek Treaty. And when they finally got him onto that executioner's table, canoes came from everywhere. People came from everywhere. They surrounded that courthouse, and for 300 days and 300 nights, they kept the drumbeat going because they wanted Chief Leshai to know that he wasn't alone, that they wouldn't give up the fight. And the last words to the people, he said, "A great many of our traditions are going to be lost. But Squaliapsh, don't forget the water. Tukwama, don't forget the mountain that you come from. And there will come a time when our spirit will be strong again. And when that time comes, I'll be there with you." And so for the first time in over 400 years, almost 500 canoes landed on the shores of Nisqually. And as we landed, we sang this song for the spirit of Chief Leshai. It went like this. It went, "Oh, hiya, hey, tuck, hiya, hey, hiya, hey, hiya, hey, Squaliapsh, hiya, hey." Singing out to the spirit of Chief Leshai, we didn't forget the water. We didn't forget where we come from. So we know there's been incredible spiritual loss in our communities. But we also know that we're living in a time of incredible cultural resurrection. And for me, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to share that with you in a generation where it's legal, somewhat, to be an Indian. What an incredible privilege. And so I ask you as I leave you this evening, when you imagine Native America, help us to imagine a future an indigenous Wakanda, if you will, where our knowledge systems, our belief systems, our strength and resiliency is also a part of that narrative. Thank you so much. If you could give another round of applause to our Uncle Mark here, who joined the stage. Mark Trahant.
Thank you for those beautiful presentations. Let me start with this. One of the things that we talked about earlier is this idea of place and how significant it is. But as I saw the photos and stories, I also thought of time. And when people think of time, almost every story that's taught in school starts with America's, whether in the 1400s or 1700s. But when there's a 10,000-year history, think of how much you're missing. And when you talked about canoe journey, that really reminded me that it's only been a couple hundred years that canoes haven't been used, and much longer period where they have. And yet we think about that little slice of time and use it to define.
Mm-hmm. Do you want me to talk about time?
Sure.
Or is there another question?
No.
Daniella, go ahead.
No, please. You've got something queued up.
I think about Indian time and what that means. And one thing I like to think about whenever the discussion of time comes up, I think about our calendars that we subscribe to, and the fact that our children are still having to choose, my nephew included, myself included. Will I subscribe to my smokehouse longhouse culture? Will I make time for Pueblo culture? Will I have time to go into the kiva? Will I have time to go into the longhouse? Will I have time to go fishing? Of course, my calendar is very different than the Western biblical calendar or the farmer's calendar. And so part of the conversation of time right now is the conversation of how do we shape policy and space for our indigenous youth to have the opportunity to have the time to participate in their traditional knowledge structures. And of course, the other part of the rewriting of the narrative around time has to do with this idea that the history started when colonizers arrived here. And so we often shape the narrative as though this is the first time this has ever happened here. This is the largest city, as though without really knowing the indigenous history that was here pre-colonization.
And in fact, many of the stories told about Native Americans now are about natives as a rural people and isolated, yet North America was home to some of the great cities that rivaled those of Europe during the same period of time. Mm-hmm. Another thing that came through in the photographs from both of you was this idea about how things that we think of in the past are current. And whether it's residential schools, which a new policy is being debated about that as we speak, to the Indian Child Welfare Act, and the idea that removing a child is somehow in the best interest of any family.
Well, we were talking about this a little earlier, that to some extent, I think that photographers and journalists in particular hope that one thing our work can do is allow us to learn and not repeat the same mistakes again and again and again. And yet, Matika expressed the opinion earlier that, it's often not enough, that often the stories don't feel like they're having the impact that we want or believe that they will. And, we look at all the stories that we've told tonight, and they're all cyclical. In policy, in social attitude, repeated on different ethnic groups in different times and places in this country. And so it sometimes gets a little frustrating and depressing of what's our role? How do we figure out how to break that cycle? How do we figure out how to create impact in a real, meaningful way?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Mark, I'm glad you brought up ICWA. It's probably the most important conversation that we could be having right now in this current moment, given the fact that the Supreme Court is relooking at the Indian Child Welfare Act. It's incredibly dangerous. Of course, for many years, the policy was to remove our children from our communities, and so policies, laws had to be created to protect our children, to keep them in our communities, because we know if we remove our children from our communities, we strip them from their cultural knowledge and their sense of belonging. And so we had to create policy so that our children were not taken from our communities and adopted out, because I mean, for many years, several different religious groups would come and take children and adopt them. So the Indian Child Welfare Act was enacted, and then recently a court case was heard in Oklahoma where a family was suing for a Cherokee baby, and the judge overturned ICWA and said it was unconstitutional and a violation of religious freedom, and if I'm the way I understand it. And so now that will be one of the first cases that will be heard, potentially by Kavanaugh. And right, and yeah, you can sigh. And so there's speculation that this case is in some ways pointing in a direction of trying to overturn tribal sovereignty altogether. And that's happened many times in the history of our country. And I know, Mark, you can speak to this much better than I can, so I'll let you do that. But we know that we are facing a major sovereignty case coming up very soon that needs support, especially here. Yeah.
Well, it's been under assault, basically. The idea that tribes were here first and tribal governments were here first has been the premise of federal law, and suddenly that's under challenge for many, many quarters. One of the things, and you mentioned the reclaiming truth narrative, that has come through that I think both of your images spoke to me to anyway, is the idea that from all the absurd images to all of the heartbreaking images, the other one is the missing images. The stories that don't get told. One of the ways that study put it was the invisibility of Native Americans. Maybe talk about that a minute.
Well, I remember one of the first conversations I ever had with Tristan Atone, who wrote one of the two stories that's in the December issue of the magazine. And one of the two things he told me was, one, that people outside of Indian country only seem to want to cover Native Americans if they fell onto tropes that he described as the 4 Ds. So Indians who were drunk, dancing, drumming, or dead, which is accurate, crass but accurate. And the normalcy and the everyday was just completely absent, that you end up with this pull between the tropes that we see so often, and then indigenous journalists who feel like they are then beholden to pull that in the opposite direction, who then have to say, okay, there is joy, there is success, there is happiness, which is important, but then you lose the mundane. There's just no room left for that. And I think if anyone here is familiar with the Everyday Africa Project and the Everyday Projects in general, that's what they seek to do, is say there are more narratives on this continent than just extreme poverty and extreme wealth. There is all this stuff in between. And so I think that's what we lose most in coverage of almost every group of people of color in this country.
In a way, it's even more complex for Native America because you can't understand American history without knowing this. And the depth of knowledge that people have about their own country and how it fits into a larger story. One of the ones, in fact, Matika mentioned my favorite story in all of your slides, and that is the story of Taos Pueblo. And what I particularly like about that story is, for those who don't know it, the U.S. Department of Agriculture created a forest and took away Blue Lake, which was the most sacred place to the Taos Pueblo. And for 40 years, they basically said, we're going to get it back. It's a question of when, not if. Didn't even blink about it. Knew that there was a time when it would be returned. And so during, of all things, the Nixon administration, they're moving through to create a new federal Indian policy, and they're about to announce it. And somebody goes to John Ehrlichman, and John Ehrlichman listens and sees the case for Taos Pueblo and says, wow, this is really an injustice. And of course, he was thinking, I'm going to screw the Democrats. And so he decided to push the return of Blue Lake. Well, the senator at the time was a guy by the name of Clinton Anderson of New Mexico, and he was adamant that Blue Lake would never be returned. He had been the Secretary of Agriculture, so he'd been in charge of the Forest Service, and he went to great lengths to make sure that never happened. Well, a combination of the Nixon White House and very liberal members of the Senate worked through legislation and passed it to return Blue Lake to the Pueblo. And when they did that, the Pueblo religious leader was in the Senate floor, and it's the one time that they broke all protocol. He rose up in the Senate floor and lifted a cane that had been given to the Pueblo by Abraham Lincoln, and the entire Senate turned and stopped, looked up into the gallery. You're not supposed to do a public display, but all the senators started clapping. And it was that moment in history that reminds things how sometimes it gets right, and there are ways that these stories works out. The point I wanted to make, and this is kind of long-winded, but the point I wanted to make about this is if you go to the Pueblo today on the anniversary of Blue Lake, every grade school tells this story. The kids do drawings, the kids do plays, they do things to tell this story. And I think that's the narrative that's not been told, is these stories of excellence, these stories of success that have been part of the history all along that have somehow been ignored and have been missing from the discourse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, because, to go back to your question about invisibility and reclaiming Native truth, if you don't know about reclaiming Native truth, it's a project that was recently, a fact-finding project that was recently done by the Echo Hawk Foundation to evaluate what people know and think about Native America. And so that's where some of those statistics that I was drawing upon were found. It was just published like last month. And Dr. Stephanie Freiberg says that the invisibility of Native America is the highest form of racism. And, also in that is the invisibility of Native America and the representation of Native America by non-natives and decisions being made for natives by natives is decisions done to us. And when that continuously happens over and over and over again, it continues to challenge our ability to build strong nations, to build healthy communities, to lift up the self-esteem of our youth. All of these, our everyday lives are deeply impacted by destructive narratives when those are the only narratives that are told. And my favorite part of the Reclaiming Native Truth project was when I heard Stephanie give the presentation. So they used some of my imagery in their research. And of course, we had this idea, which I think is probably an idea that we all believe or want to believe, is that if we educate the general public and if we tell the stories of these communities, then perception will change, and therefore policy will change, and the experiences in our lives will change. And I believe this. That's why I moved into a van. And, and then, of course, what we did is we polled all of these kids, and we realized that some, like 85% of them, like high 80s, I can't remember, it could be 89, believed that in the bootstrap mentality, and they also believe that natives are extinct, and they know very little of systemic oppression or marginalization. And so given that sort of, given that that's where most of our undergraduate students are right now, how do they actually vote on matters of tribal sovereignty? Or what do they think about ICWA? Or what do they think about Native people? And so we start looking into that. And we realize, of course, that it's all backwards, because what kids learned was, like Daniella said, Pocahontas, Christopher Columbus, Thanksgiving. And so we're like, you know what? We'll just teach them. No problem. We'll just do Indian 101. We'll start with Manifest Destiny. We'll go through termination, relocation, assimilation. We'll bring them all up to speed. We'll do it in a 12-week course. And of course, at the end of that course, we go back to reevaluate what sort of decisions they would make. And God darn it, none of them changed their minds. I was beside myself. I was like, I couldn't stop the tears from flowing because I've dedicated my life to believing that if we change the narrative, we'll change the experience for our kids. So we went back to the drawing board. And instead of teaching them, as we normally do from textbook, and testing them, we decided, you know what? We'll just bring together different communities and we'll spread the table. that's what we did. For 16 weeks, we brought people from different ethnic backgrounds together on college campuses, and we had them have conversations, just whatever organic conversation comes up. And 16 weeks later, they'd all changed their minds about the way that they view Native people. So what we learn from that is not that what we teach them is going to change anything, but the relationships that we have is what deeply impacts racism. It's the people that stand beside us at our wedding, the people that come to our funerals, our best friends at our Thanksgiving table. It's those relationships, those intimate relationships. If those are relationships with people that look different than us, that come from different places, then we're doing the work of dismantling racism. And not until that happens are we actually doing that work.
But my question for you. But my question for you is, what do you do in the school districts, in the two photos that I showed of middle school and high schoolers in schools where they have Native mascots? Those are both school districts that are 97% white. Mm-hmm. How do you create the same experience for those kids?
If you live in an environment, you're saying, where there's not access to different folks, or is there just so much segregation because of like historical lending in that society that all of the brown folks are living over here and all of the non-brown folks are living over here? Because we know that right now, right, like we are more segregated than we ever have been in the history of this country. And I saw this, I was at NCORE and I saw this presentation, this map representing where people are living now, and maybe our schools aren't segregated, maybe the policy is not segregation, but we are definitely living in segregated neighborhoods, and therefore our kids are experiencing that all over again. So I wonder, is the case that there's no brown people, or that they've been separated from one another?
In those two specific school districts, it's just that there are no people of color around.
That's strange.
We want to open it up to folks in the audience, but before we do that, just one last question. What's the one story you want people to remember from tonight? What's the takeaway?
I think approaching it from the non-native perspective, for me, the takeaway is, I think is trying to step outside of ourselves, trying to reframe our position in society, in America. You know, the conversations that I have so often with students who are the most receptive to these ideas, but who often react with, well, my ancestors didn't come over on the Mayflower, my ancestors weren't colonizers, why is this something that I need to feel guilt or responsibility or shame or any of these emotions for? And the fact is, you know, I wasn't a colonizer either. My mother immigrated from Vietnam, and my dad's parents are Eastern European Jews who were fleeing the Soviet Union. But have I benefited from the colonization of this country? Absolutely. We all have in this room if we are non-native. And I think being able to even just frame our country in that way, to think about America as something that was built with slave labor on stolen land, just that mentality allows us to have conversations that we have never opened ourselves up to before.
And therefore a pathway to reclamation and healing. Yeah, I agree.
So your story. The
What?
story.
Oh, yeah. I hope that when you leave here tonight, you find ways to become closer with your Indigenous relatives. The work, often what happens when I give these talks is inevitably somebody will raise their hand and say, but I just don't know what to do, tell me what to do. And it's like, I can't fix a broken system and tell you how to fix a broken system that your ancestors created, or my ancestors created, or, we all are in the same space together, I think, figuring out how it is that we're going to move forward together in a good way, with open hearts, open minds, with one mind. How do we come together collectively And I really fundamentally believe that if we begin creating relationships with one another, and not just with one another, the human beings, but relationships with the land, understanding what is the place-based identity of the place that I'm occupying, what does it mean to become a steward of the place that I'm occupying, what does it mean to become an ally, an advocate, an accomplice to the indigenous people of the space that I'm occupying, and how in those ways can I build those relationships, then in that way you will find together a pathway forward. And so hopefully from tonight you realize that Native America is not extinct, that the extinction narrative needs to be an extinction narrative, that narrative is no longer relevant and no longer deserves to be on the cover of anything. Indigenous people are not going to be extinct. And so if we can let that idea go, we can move forward into a place where we can start imagining new futures, but that does not happen until we first acknowledge that Native communities are alive, thriving, representing ourselves in Congress. Shout out to Deb and Charisse. And if we then believe that Native America is alive and real and we're on Indigenous land, if we believe that, then we start to maybe see a new narrative, a new conversation, a new dialogue, and that would be dope.
I think we are going to close it now, and Matika is going to close it.
So I think we'll close the room in a good way. This time last year, my grandma passed away, and before she did, she came to one of my talks, and she said, Matika, you didn't open with a prayer or close with a prayer. And I was like, well, I know, Graham, because there's a bunch of white people there. And she said, well, that's not where you come from. So you better do like I taught you, or else I'll come back for you. So I thought of her when we're doing this, and I think the conversations we had tonight are difficult conversations. We had conversations about the human experience that we're all a part of, and so I'll close us out in a good way. Make my grandma happy, and I'll close with a healing prayer song. It's a song that it comes from a house. Anine. It means that we invite the spirit into the room, and it's a prayer for you, for the work that you're doing for you in your lives, and for your spirit, so that you can feel good about this. Move forward in a good way. You know, take the things that you've learned here tonight, bring them with you, share them with your friends and relatives. You know, and that's the great hope, and so that you leave here with your heart feeling good. You know, leave in that way. And so I'll say that prayer for you, and you can stand if you want.